It's important to talk about trauma and how it affects human nature. It's very important to not exaggerate and to obsess over trauma and make that so powerful that it's more powerful than your own ability to overcome it. Trauma does impact you, but the way we understand trauma in the sense that it has devastating, lifelong, permanent effect, that is not really true. That is incorrect. Not all forms of trauma lead to permanent damage and effect. In modern psychology and modern therapy models, the way trauma is taught, it's as though trauma is pulling the strings on all our behaviors and especially on our negative behaviors, and as though we can't intervene or we don't have any choice in the decisions that we're making. And we understand it as though it determines our identity, when really it affects our ability to make good choices and make healthy, positive decisions for our lives. When we're operating from trauma, we are usually destructive, we are usually making bad decisions and bad life choices. But it's not to say that it determines our behavior and it determines our future. I think many psychologists and therapists abuse the concept of trauma and they exaggerate the effect it can have. And some people love trauma and they love to dwell and sit in trauma. And some people want to go beyond that. They don't make trauma the be all and end all of their life. They acknowledge it, but they don't think that it determines everything in their life. But you'll hear some psychologists and people who talk to you about healing, and whilst it's necessary to have compassion and empathy, it's also necessary to be realistic. We have to understand that some people benefit from keeping us in a state of trauma. If we're in a state of trauma, they get to benefit from us financially, they get to benefit of our energy, they get to benefit of our stories, our vulnerability. People can really benefit from your trauma, and that's something that we need to understand, that therapy comes with a financial benefit. And so the models that we have will be models that support financial exploitation or financial benefit to the psychologist or therapist. People want you to buy, people want you to constantly be in need of them. And that is how the therapy model is. The therapy model is always keeping you dependent, always keeping you in a state of trauma, and never really fixing anything. It offers you some support and some help, but it doesn't really and completely lead to healing. And it doesn't lead to you understanding for your own self how to take control of yourself in the future. When you are affected by trauma in the future, how do you navigate that? And I don't think we have that understanding of whether we can actually deal with our traumas without the need of therapy, without the need of other people to fix it for us. And so it supports the idea that trauma is lifelong and trauma determines how you behave, the choices that you make. If we understand trauma like injury, there are some injuries that have permanent effect, and there are some injuries, and most injuries don't leave scars. Most injuries don't affect us for long. And so if we understand that with trauma, when you experience abuse in any form, which is verbal, physical, mental, every kind of abuse, not every abuse leads to the same level of impact. We've experienced many bruises, many cuts in our lives, and most of them have never left any damage. Most of them have not even left a mark. But there are some injuries that might have left a scar. There are some injuries that took longer to heal. On the rare occasion, there are some injuries that results in a lifelong change. And that is the same way trauma affects us. Majority of the traumas that we experience don't leave lifelong effect or don't affect us for most of our lives. We don't carry it. With trauma, it does take time to process and to heal and for it not to affect you anymore. But with time, sometimes time, it just takes time to heal, and just giving it time allows the pain and the effect to disappear. And just like injury in the beginning, it might affect your life, it might affect the way you do things, but eventually it disappears, it heals, the body heals, and some leave scars, some of them don't. And that is the analogy with trauma as well. Trauma is a psychological wound, whereas what we're comparing it to is a physical wound. And the body has mechanisms in place, automatic mechanisms that we don't even need to think about, that are in place to support healing. And so just like the body heals physical injuries, the body also can heal psychological injuries and psychological wounds. I came across someone who was claiming they have narcissistic personality disorder and is diagnosed. And I thought about how we diagnose problematic behavior. So instead of the person taking responsibility for who they are and the person that they've become, which is controlling, manipulative, desiring the pain and suffering of others, instead of taking accountability for the person and the choices that they make in life, they've got this diagnosis that allows them to continue as they are and blame the body and the mind for how it behaves, as though that person doesn't have any free will, it doesn't have any choice in what it does. And I think that this is the danger of modern psychology, where we're just diagnosing people with illnesses and disorders as though people are not making any choice. The reality is that people who are manipulative, that is a choice. And yes, that person might have experienced trauma, but what is occurring is that that person is using their trauma to create trauma for others. Or there are cases where people do not even experience a high level of trauma or do not even experience highly traumatic situation, but still end up being very troubled people. It doesn't necessarily mean that that person has trauma. And as though there's nothing, when people say that I lack empathy, they talk about empathy as though it cannot be developed, as though empathy is not a skill you can, that as though it doesn't require action. So with anything, if you take actions, it eventually will lead to some change. And this is my problem with psychology and modern psychology anyways, which is that we just diagnose people, and that diagnosis is there to make it acceptable for people to behave badly and for people to cause other people suffering or to cause themselves suffering. All of these disorders, these are extremes in behaviors, and these extremes might have occurred because of coping mechanism, of trying to cope with life, of trying to deal with trauma. And instead of resisting those urges, we're taught that no, this is who you are, this is your identity, and we carry disorders like they're our identity, and we don't have any control over who we become and what choices we make. And so this is the problem. The diagnosis should push people to change, should push people to do better, to become better people and to heal. But what these diagnoses are doing are enabling people to continue as they are. For example, empathy. Some people lack empathy. If you look at their lives and their behaviors, are they doing anything that is self-sacrificing? Are they doing anything that is caring? Are they doing anything that contributes to other people without having any benefit to themselves. And when you look at their lives, you see that there's constant taking, there's constant lack of empathy. And the reason why I don't believe empathy is fixed, your level of empathy is fixed, and that it can't be developed is because it's not true. It's just not true that the level of empathy you have now will always be your level of empathy, and it's unchanging and is determined by your biology. It's not true. People change, people's level of empathy changes with experience, it changes with behavior and taking certain actions. The more acts you do with the intention of compassion and with the intention of love, the more you will experience that feeling. And the more actions you have that have the intention of harm or have the intention of personal benefit, the more it will drive you to be selfish. Love and compassion are things you can develop just by action. Whenever you do things for other people, you develop love. That's just how love develops within human beings. The more you do something, the more love you have. And so, empathy, the person who lacks empathy, it is because they're not doing a lot of acts of love or acts of compassion, and they're not really pushing themselves to fight against it. For example, there are some people that hate physical touch, so they don't like hugging, they don't like you to get too close. But if that person who doesn't like physical touch, they continue to avoid hugs and avoid getting close to people, there will always be someone who dislikes physical touch. But if they push past that and they challenge themselves to actually, even if I don't like it, I will accept physical touch, you will see that there would be a difference in their ability to receive and give physical affection. It's all about what we practice in our lives. It's the same thing with boundaries, it's the same thing with assertiveness. That all of these things, you're not a people pleaser because that is a fixed personality trait. No, you are just taking the actions of people pleasing. You're just not taking the actions that assertive people would take. But if you did, and if you repeatedly took the actions of assertive people, you would become assertive. If you repeatedly took the actions of compassion, you would become a compassionate person. So this idea that if you repeatedly took the actions of healing, you would heal. But the more you sit with that identity of trauma, the more you sit in it, the more you will experience or you will feel fixed in your state of trauma. So most of our traumatic experiences, especially in the privileged part of the world, it is something that we can heal from. It's not something we need to carry for life. And if we understand that, perhaps it would lead to more empowered people. But there are people that propagate this idea of a weak self and a damaged self. And human beings are not victims forever. Human beings are not damaged forever. They might experience temporary effects. It might impair their ability to make good decisions. It might impair their ability in other ways, but it is not permanent. It isn't lifelong. And I think that's important to understand when we talk about trying to develop ourselves and trying to grow into our highest potential as human beings.